Series. My name is Christina Wakeham of Christina Wakeham Counseling and Consulting. I come to you from Canada's most easterly province, Newfoundland and Labrador. We are known here for our colorful housing and personalities. Our heritage is founded on resiliency of our people who have adapted to the never-forgiving weather and rugged land. Surrounded by the fierce Atlantic Ocean, our four people were able to see beyond the fog to the beauty and resources this rugged land has to offer. With breathtaking views and landscapes, the abundance of natural resources. To give you some context, I came to meet Elaine in 2015 through my work as a social worker with a social housing program. After visiting thousands of homes and noticing that some people I was working with were struggling to maintain their home environment. My research led me to Elaine and my educational journey began. As I learned about what I was seeing and how best to help individuals regain control over their home space. Over the years, I've worked with many individuals who are in a state of feeling chronically overwhelmed, like many of you. Most recently, this is a common theme among women I supported through drop-in counseling at a women's center. Like many of you, I too wear many different hats as a partner, daughter, mother, sister, social worker, community activist, and volunteer. From my work experience, I can tell you firsthand that maintaining healthy boundaries is difficult, but it's also a necessary evil. Now more than ever, has our daily demands increased with our work and personal lives. Over the years, I've worked with many individuals who are overwhelmed and on that verge of burnout, prioritizing others' needs over their own. I myself have had the experience of burnout. For the first time, it was after working 4 years into my social work career, working in a crisis-driven environment. And then again later, I was reminded of my work boundaries when I returned to work after having my first child. How did I know it was burnout? Because I felt it. I felt it in my bones. And it began to impact my ability to show up and genuinely play and enjoy the people and activities I cared about most. With my impulsive personality traits, I was always up for anything and never wanted to disappoint. I actually prided myself on not saying no and juggling many balls at once. Nonetheless, what happened was I continued to neglect my own needs and showed up in ways like things piling up in my home space, not getting my laundry done, failing to prioritize my meals, thus having to run out for takeout unnecessarily, oversleeping or undersleeping, depending on what was going on for me that day. This led to further issues for me, and I became sick and exhausted, no longer able to do the things I need that provided me the fuel. Nutritious food, sleep, rest, and exercise, along with time to play. The many daily living tasks that sustain us and provide us with the food our bodies need were the very things I traded to meet all the needs of others. And the pitfall for me was having a high level of energy, which allowed me to push way beyond my boundaries because people in my life gave me praise and actually idealized my ability. At one point, I was even working full-time, taking care of a 2-year-old, completing my master's, volunteering, but continuing to try and maintain connections with family, friends, and myself. At a breaking point, I sought support from a counselor who sat across from me in awe, and instead of listening, she too reinforced the superhero syndrome I had. At this point, I was lucky enough to have enough experience that I needed a different type of support and help. We are all humans. None of us are superhuman, and let me tell you, your quest to be so will catch up on us. I share these experiences with you because I came to realize through my work counseling women at the Women's Center that many of us, particularly women, are overstretched thin as they try to manage the competing needs of those around us with their own. But as Elaine has stressed in previous sessions on boundaries, the importance of identifying our A and B list needs to ensure that we're getting enough to sustain healthy connections with others. We need to have healthy boundaries with ourselves first. We are number one. There's a reason when we get on a flight that the flight attendant reminds us to put on our own mask before assisting others. If we don't have that flow of oxygen, to sustain us and make good decisions, how are we going to help others in those situations? Reflecting on my experiences of burnout, it's no wonder it happened to me. I was famous for not knowing how to say no, impulsively saying yes without considering all the other things I had on my plate. I had this fear of letting people down as a people pleaser. I was really good at saying yes, but didn't know how to say no. And when I did, it was usually no for now, but I will later, even though I still didn't have time later. It's really important to practice saying no and mean it. My superhero syndrome, combined by my need to be a people pleaser, was a recipe for burnout. Giving too much of myself and not leaving enough for me. Letting myself run on empty, except I always had a little on reserve for others' crisis. When I know from my work that most times when people want us to respond to crisis, it's typically not a crisis. And if truthfully people are in crisis, perhaps they should be calling emergency services, not you. And in actual fact, what we know is when we wait, often the crisis self-resolves and the situation returns. And the individual learns more from resolving it themselves. So I checked all the boxes, had all the ingredients for burnout, which led me to burnout twice before hearing the message. And now, what I know is that when we continue not to listen to those messages that we're presented with, they will continue to present themselves until we do something about it. So raise your hand if you've ever felt like you're in the rat race at the end of the week, because that's me. Exhausted by this week's activities and overwhelmed what left to do. Remember, this is a red flag, highlighting a need to look at boundaries. I challenge you during these moments to stop. That's a skill I had to learn, and a really important one, especially with impulsivity. And reflect on how we're spending the time and what we're doing, ensuring that what we're doing is what's really important to us. So boundaries, they may seem easy. By definition, they're just a line that marks the limits of an area. When we think about physical boundaries, it's often easier to define. We can see markers physically like fencing, brick walls, plotted points on a map, or even outlining geographical areas. However, boundaries within our interpersonal relationships are less visible and rigid, as they shift and evolve over time with our needs. Having personal boundaries is our personal map, our own manual that teaches others how to treat us. When our boundaries are too rigid, like that of a brick wall, we risk isolating ourselves from opportunities for connection. For example, if we choose not to compromise around family events, oftentimes we might find that we're let down. Or on the opposite end of the continuum, when our boundaries are too loose, we risk losing ourselves and we prioritize other needs while our own go unmet. For example, as I did, continuing to volunteer despite the fact I had no longer had time for myself. When thinking about boundaries, it's helpful to look at the signs of unhealthy relationships. Unhealthy relationships and boundaries are interconnected in my experience. Unhealthy relationship patterns typically start with boundary issues, but the flip side is also true. Thus, establishing healthy boundaries is a tool that regenerates and restores, often creating stronger bonds between individuals. So, how do we know if we're having relationship issues? We can sense it. We can feel it in our bones, we can see it in the actions, and we can hear it in the words. Have you ever been in a situation where you feel like you're not able to express your needs because the other person refuses to listen? Or you get that feeling in your stomach that it's not safe to do so? Has someone close to you ever refused to meet your reasonable requests? Like not using your preferred name or pronouns, which happens regularly to New Canadians and gender diverse folks I work with. Is there a presence of abuse? There's various levels. Let's look at them. Physical, hitting, it can show up like hitting, throwing, intimidation. Is there sexual abuse? Not respecting sexual limits, obtaining for consent, or sidelining your needs. Emotional abuse. This can look like name calling, belittling, playing mind games with you. One that some people don't think about often, spiritual abuse. Not allowing you to truly practice your religious rituals, or undermining them or making fun of them, or perhaps even ruining your reputation within the church. And lastly, let's think about financial abuse. Is someone in your relationships controlling your money and excluding you from important financial decisions? Have you ever had that person in your life that leaves you feel sad, angry, drained, disappointed after most interactions? You may even question from time to time why you can still interact with them. Or is there a lack of trust in your relationship? For example, do your partner call you unnecessarily to the point that they're taking away time that you're spending with others? Or do they question you to the point when you're not with them, to the point about where you're spending and how you're spending your time? Have you ever had someone that you communicated clearly your need for things to change, and that person refuses to change some unhealthy behaviors? Like a coworker that continuously second guesses you in front of others and dismisses your ideas before hearing them. Do anybody in your relationships struggle with addiction that is harmful to others? As this too can be an indicator of unhealthy relationships. What I know from my work with people with addictions, they have a primal need to meet their addiction, and that outweighs any needs of the people that they're working and interacting with. Thus, they often push boundaries and take from relationships and are unable to show up and give back in the same way, often learning to relationship burnout. Okay, so now that the juices are flowing, as we think about our relationships and boundaries, let's take a closer look at the top relationship areas where people struggle from my experience. Family. So family is a big one. Family is where people experience the biggest boundary challenge in my experience. Who out there has the perfect family? None of you, because they don't exist. Which is also not likely a surprise to anybody listening here today. Our family tend to be our longest and consistent relationship, and it follows us through our many, many life transitions and stages. Thus, family boundaries shift and grow more often, leaving more opportunities for unhealthy relationships to develop. Also, when we're at our worst, and we do get to our worst sometimes, we regularly take it out on those who are our closest. We're more likely to do boundary violations with our family because they have more to lose, and thus they tolerate more on the flip side. Our family is the foundation from where we learn about boundaries. From birth, we learn about how to interact from our caregivers, who teach us how important our needs are from the time we're very, very little babies. How our caregivers respond to those needs when we cry as our primal way of communicating will dictate how we feel as young age about our boundaries and how important they are and how important they are to be meshed. So when a baby cries, does the parent react immediately, overreact, or are they on the other end? They're too overwhelmed with things that they don't react at all or even forget about us. Thus, the importance of modeling good boundaries for children. Children who respect their boundaries and make space for parents who respect the boundaries and make space for their children help their children feel safe and loved. They also reinforce those positive habits of how to express your needs. When parents on the other end ignore children's preferences of how they might like to dress or what they might like to eat regularly, and they're not able to have self-expression, children feel lonely, neglected, like their needs don't matter. And what we know is they'll struggle with boundary issues throughout their lives. My work with individuals who grew up in the child welfare system in unstable homes taught me the most about boundaries and their importance in those early developmental years. Shocked when I saw my first full-blown adult temper tantrum in my office when I set a boundary that a client couldn't accept. It resulted in them reverting to childlike behaviors as a way to communicate what they really needed, which was often to be listened to have some structure and predictability and compassion. I'll share a quick example with you. One day in Newfoundland torrential weather and wind, and it can get really bad here, I was driving to a space where I was volunteering. Along the way, I saw a participant walking. I worked with this individual in the daytime in my job as a case manager, and I regularly drove to various appointments. But against better judgment, I flexed my boundary by picking them up and getting them out of the harsh weather. Even though, as in my role as volunteers, I was not supposed to drive participants. This individual struggled with a combination of trauma, cognitive impairments, and attachment issues. Picking her up opened the door for her to challenge my boundaries whenever she was in crisis and needed a ride. She pushed boundaries regularly when she saw opportunities, rationalizing and questioning me. When she get really stressed, she would even melt down again in what would look like an adult-like temper tantrum. Even though I reinstated my boundaries for years with her around rides and never drove her under those circumstances again, she will still, to this day, and I'm sure when I return to work after mat leave, continue to push back and test me to see if there's a possibility to have me flex again. Which highlights an important point. Oftentimes, and I mean often, we need to remind people of our boundaries, particularly when they've shifted from previous interactions. So, what does family boundary issues look like? I'm sure you all know it. Again, you can feel it. So with your parents, what are some signs? They're over-involved in your daily life. They don't respect your decisions as an adult. They treat you like a child, etc. What do creating boundaries look like? Creating space for yourself, not oversharing or being over-involved in each other's lives. Using I statements when communicating to say, and I've used this with my mom, I need you to call before coming to my house. This was a sticky point for us because my mother believed that because she was my mother, even after I moved out, she had the right to access me at any point. Thus, she would continue to challenge this boundary until one day when she came up and I had it up to here with not listening to my boundaries, I opened the door, asked her to call me, and closed it, and told her to come back when she had called me and she could have a cup of tea. Needless to say, she was very hurt and she didn't call me for over a couple of weeks. I did reach out back to her and have a conversation, and from there, by setting those clear boundaries, it was one that was able to be reinforced and respected. It's not until we set boundaries with our parents do we truly become adults. When we set boundaries with our parents, we do have to remind them because they will revert back to those old boundaries that they're more comfortable with. Remember, boundaries are hard, particularly with parents. And like water, we all prefer to take the path of least resistance. So let's shift and look at family boundaries around the holidays. Anybody have any signs they need them? Do you spend your holidays running around like a chicken with your head cut off, doing celebrations rather than enjoying them? I have from time to time. So what do boundaries around that time look like? Ahead of time, letting people know your plans and intentions, and you expressing your needs to have space and time to relax, enjoy the holidays rather than just going through the motions. Remember, holiday traditions are a time to be enjoyed, and they're meant to evolve over time. Otherwise, they'll lose the joy in them. Boundaries with our in-laws. This is a big one for people because there's a lot of competing interests. So what are some signs we might need boundaries with our in-laws? Are your in-laws getting involved in your relationship with your partner? Are they getting in between you and your children? Are they continuously making comments or digs towards you that make you feel less than or leave you frustrated? Not respecting your rules with the children, ignoring your needs or silencing you is what unhealthy boundaries sound like with our in-laws. When we do experience unhealthy boundaries with our in-laws, it's first important to have a conversation with our partner. And what would that look like? Hey, I really don't like it when your mother, ... questions my parenting, or whatever we want to fill that blank in with. It makes me feel like, whatever we want to say there, I'm not a good mother. And then together, you can make a plan to have a conversation with the in-law. In my experience, it's helpful for both partners to have a united front and have a discussion with the in-laws together. That both express their boundaries and request that they be respected. For example, Joe and I have noticed that, you guys fill in the blank, every time we come over, you feed the children candy, even though we don't want them to have that. This makes us feel like we are not good parents. What we need is when the kids come over, we need you to, and be very explicit of what that is. So, boundaries with our children. These are tough ones because our children's boundaries look different from the time they're children, and then as they grow up through all these developmental stages. So the need for privacy as a young child versus the need for privacy as an adult would be very, very different. But when you need boundaries with your children, we know this because we often see defiant behavior. And that's outside the typical, because children are defiant, outside the typical. Breaking rules around bedtime, not being able to participate in mealtime, having complete meltdowns and tantrums that are frequent and intense in duration, using very demanding language. My child did this to me the other day, actually. Mom, get this. And I just stopped and said, I really don't like the way you're talking to me right now. This is how it makes me feel. And that was an opportunity for him to learn that isn't an appropriate way to speak, and that's against my boundaries. And when you do that, I'm going to correct you and not automatically respond. Teaching kids how to have healthy boundaries is vital. As adults, we need to learn and remember that kids are mini us. They model our behaviors. They're like sponges, and they watch how we interact and how we get our needs met. As adults, it's our responsibility to teach them how to regulate their emotions so they can stop and think, rather than just being reactive and in their primal brain communicating their needs through outbursts, which, as they age, becomes increasingly difficult to deal with for both the child and parent perspective, the longer it continues. If children are never taught to grow into adults who can self-regulate, it will lead to childlike responses as adults. I'm sure you've had these situations where you've seen adults in front of you who are acting like 4-year-olds. The most common tool for self-regulation in my experience is deep breathing. It's simple, accessible to use when needed. I've taught this tool to my very young child. And even the other day, I was sitting on the couch frustrated about something, and I can't even remember what. But my 5-year-old stopped what he was doing over in the corner playing and instinctively came over and said, Mommy, I think you need to take 5 deep breaths. He put his hand on my shoulder, took 5 deep breaths with me, and then resumed whatever activity he was playing. As you see, when we teach skills to our children to have healthy boundaries themselves, they're better able to do it with others, saving them a lifetime of tension and stress, bringing them peace, which is what most parents want for their children, isn't it? Peace and happiness. As I mentioned, the most important relationship is that parent-child relationship. However, it's also the top relationship area where people struggle, particularly when they grow up in environments that don't meet their needs, like having very restrictive boundaries that don't allow for self-expression, or on the other hand, having parents that are so enmeshed in their lives, they prevent them from growing into independent, self-reliant, confident people. When we're over involved and we take away opportunities from our children to grow and explore, I regularly work with mothers who have friend-like relationships with their children, hang out with their preteen daughters, share clothing and makeup. It is not our role as parents to be our children's friends. Our role is as teachers, caregivers, and later mentors. What our children learn in those first several years, we know from research, is very crucial. But what we also know is the resiliency within children. And on a positive note and relief for us as parents, we don't need to be perfect 100% of the time, or even 50% of the time. As long as we're perfect, as long as we get it right and teach them skills 40 to 50% of the time, they'll usually end up okay. Our role as teachers, caregivers, and mentors requires us to shift our boundaries as their needs shift, not getting over involved in our own needs for our children. Siblings. How many of you have siblings? I see some of you raising your hand out there. Siblings is also an area where people struggle. There's a whole bunch of research about siblings and how the birth order and how that impacts people. But one of the things that I see in my work is that as we grow, our role and relationship changes significantly with our siblings. For example, an individual I worked with was struggling with a large amount of stuff in her home. Her family were giving her a hard time for clutter. At the same time, her siblings were inundating her with everything they no longer wanted. Coming from an affluent family with siblings who were professional at the top of their field, she struggled saying no to them because they were doing her a favor, because she was on a fixed income and she couldn't afford it. And she couldn't afford to say no. As the oldest child who cared for, protected, and mentored these young siblings, she felt undervalued within the family. While she longed for those interactions with her siblings, it came at a cost to her self-worth. The work focused on how she could communicate her needs, but also accepting their support on her terms. So what does that look like? This is kind of how it went. She thanked her siblings for their generous donations while explaining to them, because of how they give the donations to her, just in large amounts without ever any thought and no preparation in garbage bags, it made her feel undervalued, and then explained the types of secondhand items that she actually needs and how she would actually like to receive them. Later, when she got up the courage, she then also asked them for support in taking away all the stuff they offloaded and shamed her for. Family boundaries with parents, siblings become even further complicated with the addition of new family members. With competing needs and interests, it could be in-laws, children, step-parents, you name it. When we add people to the equation, there's likely going to be causes for stress if there's not clear boundaries communicated. It's important as we grow and adapt to our boundaries to meet our evolving needs. It may be difficult for others to respect, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. They have to adjust to their new roles and responsibilities, particularly when we're able to communicate in an effective, clear way. It's important to remember, though, with shifting needs, there's also a shift in power dynamics. As I shared with the previous example between siblings, the oldest sibling no longer was that protector that never had that role of caring in the same way for her siblings. It actually reversed, and it was like her siblings were caring for her. So that power dynamic shift is a lot of struggle for people, and people get really caught up there, particularly when we don't effectively communicate why things have shifted. Why are we showing up different? What are our new expectations? When we don't tell the why, what happens? Others are left to fill in the why. And I don't know about you guys, but in my experience, when people are left to fill out the why, it's never normally helpful. So as we shift from our family, let's take a closer look at our intimate and romantic relationships. Because next to family, this is another area where people struggle. I see some of you moving away from the camera as I bring up that topic. In romantic relationships, there's a lot of work to be done, and it continues to be a lot of work. People who are in romantic relationships who say that everything is magic and they never have conflict and always get along are lying to you. Either that, they're in some kind of fog and they don't know what's going on. Have you ever been in a relationship have you ever sat across a friend and they're told you about a romantic relationship and you're like, sounds too good to be true? That's because it likely is. It's a red flag. Boundary issues in dating often arise when we oversell and underdeliver. We agree to things at the beginning of our relationship because we are so infatuated in that lust phase that we aren't able to sustain long term. For example, I know someone who met their boyfriend after seeing each other at several social events. In the beginning, the boyfriend seemed like a socialite. But as they got serious, the girlfriend noticed that he no longer attended events with her and no longer wanted to go to these activities, which in turn caused her to feel really insecure and started to create tension between them. Which leads me to an important point. When we shift the way we show up in relationships, particularly our romantic relationships, it's important to verbalize what's caused the change. So, in that example, if the boyfriend had to explain, he only went to those events to meet someone, and now he's happy and content because he's finally found you, it could have strengthened the relationship rather cause tension. What I know is clear and open communication is vital, particularly in our romantic relationships, but in all of them. Boundary issues can come also within romantic relationships for putting too many unspoken expectations on the other person. When it comes to love, for some reason, we all want our partners to be mind readers and know everything we want without even asking. Hey, I too am guilty for this. Ask my partner. But this is an impossible expectation. When I was a kid, actually, I used to daydream about being able to read minds as my superpower. However, as an adult, I'm so grateful I don't. Can you imagine how overwhelming it would be, like Mel Gibson in the movie What Women Want, to constantly be able to read other people's minds? Some things are better left unsaid. That's why we have a filter. Being honest and upfront from the beginning of a relationship creates a foundation of trust. At the beginning, it's important to have those hard discussions about what our needs are, what our values, our dreams, to ensure compatibility. In long-term relationships, you have to set boundaries as each of you grow and your relationship evolves. Because remember, we are growing, breathing human beings. This is especially true during those life transitions, like moving in together, getting married, having children. That's actually the time when you see highest rate of conflicts and divorce through those life transitions. From my work with families, I've learned the importance of addressing communication, as it's the leading cause of marriage breakdowns. On a positive note, when we're able to express our boundaries, whether it's the beginning of a relationship or well into it, boundaries can connect us in our romantic relationships in a new way. All right. So when we think about our boundaries with our family and our romantic relationships, we often live with them. There's all these different dynamics that happen that typically don't happen for the many of our other relationships. But how about our friends? How about our relationships with our friends? Any of you out there ever felt like you were in a toxic relationship with your friend? I've had that. We know that because we're in those relationships where you're the one giving all the time and they're the one taking. And sometimes you even question why you're even friends with this person anymore. Maybe they constantly, you feel like let you down, demand too much from you, make you feel guilty. They flake out all the time on your plans, talk about you to other people and gossip. Sometimes with our friends, we do grow apart. We no longer share interests and values. Unhealthy friendships often result, though, from those unhealthy boundaries, not growing apart. Friendships where you feel like you're giving more than you're receiving are harmful. Interactions with friends that often lead in arguments are also harmful. Remember, friends are our chosen family. We get the family we get because we're born into them. But our friends are our chosen family. These relationships should bring us ease, comfort, support, and fun, not excess drama and stress in your life. So it's important to set the boundaries, because what we know, when we don't set boundaries, we often suffer the consequences of not setting them. So what are some common boundary issues with friendships? Have you ever been in a friendship relationship where you're the advisor, or perhaps you're the one that has all the money or all the things that they need? So you end up lending money and possessions, and sometimes not getting them back, or not getting them back in a respectful way. Do you have friends that offer unsolicited advice or feedback about what you should do or how you should do things? Are you getting burnt out because you're the one that's giving all the advice, or receiving the unsolicited advice? Are your friends needy? Remember, we're not our kids' friends, but we're also not our friends' therapists. There are times when we're our friends, we may want to refer them to a therapist. So how do we do this and not just be the person who's on the phone listening over and over again, taking the time from us doing the things that we really want to achieve? You can let your friend know that you've been noticing that they're overwhelmed for a while, and that while you're there to support them, you only have XXX amount to give. Show compassion for their experience while also letting them know that you are their friend, and don't feel like you're able to provide them with, actually, don't say you don't feel, you're not able, because when you say feel, they're able to kind of twist that around on you. You're not able to provide them with the support and time they need and deserve. When we have friendships and relationships that are enmeshed, remember, it's never healthy. We all are breathing, growing individuals with our own unique experiences. When we become enmeshed in our friend's identity, we become intertwined in someone else's, and we have to compromise our own needs to meet that of the others. So as I shared earlier, I have experienced burnout on 2 different occasions. The source of my burnout is going to be the next focus of relationships. And it's one that folks struggle with: work. We all have to work to get money, but I always say, I work to live, I don't live to work. I see far too many people I work with working beyond a 40-hour work week, paid and unpaid. Reporting feelings of exhaustion, frustrating, feelings of being powerless. I've learned the hard way the effects on healthy boundaries. Being overworked comes from not having good boundaries with your boss, your team, and your time. Through my experience, one of the things I realized is that being overworked was actually more in my control than I thought. I love my job as a social worker. I get the opportunity to continuously grow and learn for the people like you, the people I work with. But sometimes my passion for the work pushes me to overextend myself, which I've learned firsthand impacts how I show up, not only at work, but also my other relationships, creating limits that help me feel balance between have helped me kind of manage that balance between my personal and professional self. Nonetheless, even with strong, clear work boundaries, they're continuously challenged by increased demands, bosses' expectations, to work through your lunch or stay late or get this project finished. Thus, we need to be our own advocates and continuously communicate our needs and boundaries to our coworkers and bosses. Staying true to our boundaries and not bending to that work culture pressure to do more. Work environments, I know, that support the needs of its employees by respecting their time with family and friends can be positive. But when we don't respect our employees and their needs, the flip side can happen and it becomes toxic. In these environments, you're unable to leave work at the office or disconnect for vacation or shut off from work at a certain hour. Again, as I remind you, ignoring your own boundaries comes at the expense of your well-being and the relationship and well-being of others that are close to you. Recently, my clever 5-year-old reminded me of this when he asked, "Mommy, thought we were on vacation. Why are you working?" Toxic work environments, in my experience, are created when there's a lack of communication and transparency, or workers are held to different levels of accountability and standards. Within toxic work environments, what we know from research is morale decreases, productivity decreases, it impacts the well-being and physically and emotionally of those working within it. Someone who I worked with once, who had been experienced significant workplace violence and harassment, reminded me at a time when I was struggling, just because someone is unwell with ... because this is what happened to me, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, or having mental health struggles, whatever that blank is, does not give them permission to belittle you, disrespect you, dismiss your ideas, unnecessarily challenge your feedback, no matter what is going on with them. Oftentimes, though, in the moment, it seems easier for us to dismiss or question our own feelings when this is happening. But as highlighted from previous parts of this series, it's much healthier for everyone involved to have the difficult, uncomfortable conversations to ensure and communicate our work boundaries and needs. Everyday work boundaries at work come up, and we do have control over them. How do we handle those toxic environments? Being open and transparent about our needs and boundaries and reminding them many times if possible, if they have to. Also, being nonpartisan and not getting pulled in to that side talking gossip that's going on within the office. Addressing issues directly as they arise, and if we know and are working in a toxic environment that's chronic, look for a new job. Because over time, it will eat at you. Because toxicity spreads like cancer. And when we're burnt out at work, what happens? We're unable to show up for ourselves and others. For me, it showed up like leaving work at the end of the day and not even being able to make one more decision. Not about what I wanted to eat, where I wanted to go, how I wanted to spend my time, or even doing the daily living tasks that we needed to do to sustain the fuel. I was exhausted and overwhelmed by all the things I needed to do to provide my own basic needs, as I often watched them go unmet, blaming myself then for allowing this to happen, as I should have known better. Remember, burnout is a boundary issue, but it's also a workplace culture issue. Recently, I did a placement in an organization that worked from a trauma-informed model. They were committed to creating safe workspace for all. I remember being shocked when I heard the first person say and give somebody a hard time for frowning upon working through lunch or staying late. They actually embraced collaborative interactions with people and celebrated accomplishments. While in the meantime, they worked really hard and got what was needed done in an effective manner in the organization. They understood by supporting the workers' needs, they were able to better produce better outcomes. So how do we set those boundaries at work? One of the ways I did it, feeling like I didn't have control over the full structure of my work environment, I did know that I did have workers' rights, whether it was through through Workplace NL or through unions or through policies and procedures. We do have rights as workers, right? So knowing those rights and then knowing what our needs are, we're able to push back on those boundary limits. Being committed to yourself about leaving on time, taking breaks, and using annual leave. How many people I work with and interact with celebrate the fact that they don't take sick leave? This is a red flag that you have issues with boundaries at work. Nora, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay. How to set boundaries in the office. Be mindful of the places and spaces you go where you may interact with clients from work. So for me, working with a population of homeless folks, when I go downtown, it's likely I'm going to interact with work. So if I'm trying to disconnect from that, that's not necessarily the best place for me to go for a walk. Leave your phone home when you're not working or on call. And if possible, do not carry two phones if you have to. Do not mix your personal and professional phone if you have control over that. Try very, very hard not to, because it's hard to leave your personal phone home when it's your work phone too, or your work home phone when it's your personal phone too. Also, I learned about saying no to office connections, out of office celebrations, and all these out of office things that come out. While I do enjoy my coworkers, I spend most of my time, 40 hours a week, with these people. And on the flip side, I struggle to spend time with the family and friends I love. So even when a great event comes up, I second guess if that's something I really want to commit to right now. Also, within the workplace is overcoming that fear of perfection. I can tell you, the more you do, the more perfect you are, the more harder you work, the more that people will expect of you. They're getting a product from you working, and producing them something. So don't worry about things being perfect. in a way so that it consumes you, so that you have to take it home and work on it, so that it's this perfect piece that you're able to present tomorrow. Do what you can in the time you have and take it as good enough. One of the other areas from my work I wanted to talk about in relationships, and this kind of comes up, and I don't know if it's a struggle for any folks here, but it's dealing with those relationships and boundaries with people of authority. So in my work, a lot of folks interact with landlords, police, doctors, child protection, other areas of enforcement. And what we know is that just because of their role in enforcement, there's a huge power imbalance, right? So what often happens with that huge power imbalance, we're like, oh my God, that's the police. We got to do whatever they say. And to a certain extent, in certain boundaries, we do have to respond in a certain way, especially if we are being questioned and it's within our rights. But again, it's important to know your rights and what they are. Many people I work with in social housing often would have landlords just show up at the door, expecting you to come in and access their space. Or they would tell them things that they needed to do within their house that were outside of safety and the things that we'd all have to attain to within our regulations, within our neighborhoods and whatnot. But like things like what you kept and how you kept them, they would give input on that and disrespect people. So really, when we're working with people and there's that power imbalance, recognize that there's a power imbalance, but also remember, you always have the right to say no. And you can say no and get back to them. You don't need to respond right away in the moment. So now what? We talked about all the different areas that people struggle around family and friends and relationships with our romantic people and work and all those things. So now what? So I worked with this client and he shared something with me that really, really resonated. Work smarter, not harder. So often we think we need to do more when we're already at our max. But perhaps what we really need is to do less differently. By stopping and pausing to reflect on the powers and dynamics within our relationships, we are better equipped with the skills so that we can stop and recognize those tactics, the things that people do to push our boundaries and make us feel challenged and empty and taken advantage, rather than filling our need for social interaction. So let's take a look at how people violate our boundaries and how we can better respond. Pushback. What does pushback look like? I tell you what I need, and you say, well, I don't know if I can do that. Without any compromise, but I just can't do that. Or I'm not going to do that because it's not fair. Hey, I have needs too, and I'm not making you change. These are some phrases that we hear when we hear pushback. How do we respond to pushback? My boss does this all the time. Acknowledge that you heard the other person's concern, but reinstate, I know that things are really bad right now and there's a crisis and it could be helpful for me to stick around, but as I told you, I get my child at 4 o'clock and it's 4 o'clock. Or you can say, thank you for letting me know. However, I'm proceeding with what I need to do with my request. Understanding that you don't like my boundary, but for me to feel safe and get my needs met in this relationship, having limits helps me feel safe. These are all things that we can say back, and a lot of this information is coming from setting boundaries, finding peace. So if you want more examples, you can look at that resource. Testing limits. My 5-year-old is awesome at this. He should be here talking to you. Children do this a lot. It's a way of how they form independence when they're little. It can be really, really frustrating. Adults, though, they hear you, but they want to see how much you're willing to bend. What does this sound like for my 5-year-old? Mom, I know it's bedtime, but ... I need ... And how do you best... I started getting, and we still get in these with my kids sometimes, but you start going down the road and you're like, okay, I've over-explained myself because we're going back and forth here now, and you're trying to twist and get me to bend, right? So when someone's testing your limits, how we handle it is we be clear and say, hey, I know that you're pushing my buttons or testing my limits. And tell them how you feel. When you don't respect my boundaries, you make me feel like I'm not that important to you. Or that what I'm saying doesn't matter. Again, avoid explaining your boundaries because it leaves room for people to object to your needs. In your attempts to make others feel comfortable, we might be persuaded out of setting those healthy limits. Do your best to name the boundary without over-explaining and being talked out of it. If you want practice, I can lend out my 5-year-old. Just kidding. Ignore it. This is a really frustrating one for people to handle. People ignoring your boundaries or being passive-aggressive, pretending that they didn't hear them. But boundaries should be respected. People shouldn't ignore your rights, because what happens when that happens, it builds resentment. Ignoring boundaries is like, okay, I'm just going to do what I want even though I heard you, right? So you might have said, I don't like it the way you talk to me, and then at the same time they're communicating back to you the exact same way. Sometimes they'll even act like the boundary is misunderstood, like, sorry, I didn't really understand what you meant. So how do we handle people when they're ignoring our boundaries? Reinstate the boundary. Request even that the other person repeat back to your boundary so you can make sure they understood what you meant. Stress the importance of changing and moving forward. React immediately when you notice the issue. If not, the boundary will disappear. Rationalizing and questioning. My client I picked up in that torrential rainfall day, she's fabulous at this. And sometimes too, I get caught down the trap with her because we're all human. Rationalizing looks like, since you accepted the behavior in the past, you now deem it inappropriate, and they'll rationalize and question to the point where you can kind of get to a place where they're trying to make you bend your boundary and make it okay again. But it isn't helpful to say you're sorry when you're setting your boundaries. Sometimes we over-apologize. Culturally in Newfoundland, we see this a lot where people are constantly over-apologizing, and women as a gender do this more regularly than men as well. Remember that people benefit from us not having our limits. You have to look at yourself too. How do we make excuses for us? Because we also benefit when we don't follow through on our boundaries sometimes. It's okay to let people know that you've changed your mind and that boundaries change, and that your current or previous arrangement is no longer working and how you would like it to change. What rationalizing sounds like often is, why are you asking me to change? What's the point to doing things differently now? So how do we handle that rationalizing, questioning behavior? Again, be careful not to explain ourselves. When setting boundaries, be clear and precise. More is less. We don't want to give them too much information and over-explain ourselves. Keep responses short, like saying, "This is what's healthy for me." Saying too much will start that back and forth negotiation. Defensiveness. Defensiveness happens when we feel attacked. Being clear in our wording helps minimize defensiveness. However, people will respond differently, and some people, because of their experience, their first response is to be defensive no matter what. Defensive people will turn the issue on you because they don't want to be at fault. Defensive people aren't listening when you're talking. They are personalizing what you're saying and crafting a response. Their response has much more to do what they need than what you do. But remember, healthy relationships are never one-sided, and the needs of both are equally important. So what is defensiveness? How does that look? Explaining why you did something, accusing you of attacking them. Ever had someone accuse you of attacking them? Bringing up what you've done in the past to kind of get you to a different point. So when we come up against defensive people, how do we respond? Making it about us, using I statements are super helpful. Talking one issue at a time. The defensive people in my life that I know, at the end of the conversation, I sit back and wonder, what was that about? Because it's gone in circles. There's so much that's gone on and so many different conversations. We don't know where we started and where we left off. So keep it simple, stay on one topic. Use feeling words such as when you feel. Say something in the moment sooner rather than later. When you let things fester for weeks or months, it's often really difficult. Because then there's so much time and there's so much back and forth. When we get things in the moment, we're able to address it head on. And know your audience. If you can't talk to this person, and someone shared this with me the other day, they weren't able to communicate their needs. So after the fact, when they felt safer, they actually wrote them down and sent them in an email. So they were able to have that conversation and be heard. Ghosting. Ever had someone ghost you? And it's not someone coming back from your past haunting you. But it's ending people without explanation, ending things without explanation, just disappearing as a response. People who ghost often are passive aggressive in how they respond to you. Rather than stating what they need, they show you how they feel through their actions. So I'm really mad at you. Instead of telling them that you're really mad at you, they just don't call you for weeks and weeks on end, and you don't know why. Ghosting happens right away or a few days after you've made your wishes known. It's generally a form of punishment. Ghosting looks like not answering your texts or calls, canceling plans, or keeping in touch with some people, but leaving you out. How to handle ghosting. Send precise text messages or emails mentioning the behavior you're noticing. People are more likely to respond because they don't want to seem upset when they are. Express how ghosting makes you feel and the concerns you have about the relationship. If you receive a response in a few days, be clear to restate how ghosting makes you feel. If you don't receive a response, remember that their reaction is not about you. It was about their interpretation of the situation. Silent treatment. This is one I use sometimes. This response is a less extreme form of ghosting, but equally as painful. It's also passive aggressive and a form of pushing boundaries. The person will notably be different after you asserted your need. If you try to talk to them, they'll just give you these short responses, like say yes or no. It's lonely and confusing to be the receiver of silent treatment. The other person isn't present, but they really are. What does silent treatment look like? Going days or hours without talking, providing short responses and questioning passive-aggressive expressions when you're upset. How do we handle the silent treatment? Offer feedback about why you set your boundary. I was overwhelmed and I was unable to add another thing to my already full plate. It's not about you, it's about how I was feeling. So what works? Acceptance. It's a healthy way to respond to boundaries. It's a sign of functional, mutual relationships. Despite all the fear around boundary setting, in my experience, most people will just graciously accept your requests. When people do respond, however, in unhealthy ways, it's typically that red flag that you need to set limits a long time ago. And you need to reevaluate that relationship and assess whether your needs are satisfactorily being met. Again, remember, when relationships are all give and no take, it's very unhealthy. Most people, I've been denying these issues for way too long. Perhaps your issue is being asked to do things, saying yes, and then resenting the other person after for asking. Or your issue may be allowing someone to say things that make you feel uncomfortable. Remember, boundary issues are the cure to most relationship problems. Both parties have to participate and respect the boundaries on either side. So, before I get to your questions, on a final note, if you, and once you stop and are able to identify those boundary issues in your different areas of your life, communicate your needs and follow up with an action. Remember, you can start implementing boundaries in various aspects of your life at any time. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's easy, but I will promise you it's a worthwhile investment of your time. Because if we don't, I promise you, others will continue to suck your time and resources, leaving you feel too overwhelmed to deal with your own stuff and what matters to you. So let's have a look at the questions here. I'm going to...
I have a quick question.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
You know, you were talking, I'm trying to phrase the question in a way that I have a boundary of open and clear communication with individuals, you know, as best I can. I think I'm honest and I'm open and clear. And if I don't want to express something, I'll, usually give a reason. But if you're dealing with someone and you ask them a reasonable question and they go defensive and you say, you say, you ask it in a gentle way, it's a reasonable question, and the person completely goes defensive and then ghosts. It's not a good sign.
No. And it's not necessarily about you then, Joan, right? It's about them. And some of the things we know about people who go to that right away, that defensiveness, they probably have had a lot of experiences in their lives to get them to that point. So they need to actually go back and do their own work and work on their own communication skills. So you need to keep always remember that we only have control of how we interact with others. We can't control how they respond, right? So the tools that we talked about today is how we could better respond to get a better outcome. But there's times when we respond in all the right ways. And because of whatever's going on with them, they will just continuously be defensive and ghost and do those type of things because that's a pattern of behavior that they learned that work for them on some level.
Yeah, it's very hard for if these are like long-term relationships and then you've sort of danced around it throughout the relationship, and then all of a sudden when it comes to something that's a boundary issue for me that is unacceptable, and then they completely go defensive and they shut down, and that's it, it's over, goodbye.
Yeah, no, it's really difficult. And I guess, Joanna, depending on who these people are in their lives, is about kind of re-looking at if they're the right people to have around us, right? Because again, we can do all the things to change, but we're impacted by those other people we interact with. So the more people we can have around us that respect our boundaries and value us, that too will give us more fuel to be able to go in to doing our own things, right? People who leave us exhausted and feeling uncertain and not feeling really good at the end of the day, depending on who they are, and even with family, like close family. I mean, I've worked with people who had to cut their parents out of their lives because they were so unhealthy, and while they tried to set boundaries with them, it didn't work, and then they got to a point where their boundary had to be, I only see you on these 2 occasions a year. And that's what it looks like, and that's what it had to be for them, which isn't a great place to be with anybody. You're difficult, right? So it is, Joan, it is an easy thing. Boundaries are difficult, but again, not doing them, and the longer they go on, the more difficult they get. I'm just reading here from Lisa. She said she's so susceptible to be getting sucked into like narcissistic types. And that's really important for us to, when we know those patterns of behaviors. And I know Elaine has gone back and done some podcasts on narcissism and within parents and how they parent children and how that shows up. So that might be a great resource for you to go to. But with folks who are narcissistic, their needs are always more important than yours. You're not important in the same way. So you do have to be clear and strong about your boundaries and continuously repeat them. I'm just looking here at some more questions. This is the breakdown, especially the time. Yeah. So even that negative self-talk, like when people who we're talking and communicating with start saying things to us and belittling us and giving those messages, and particularly like Joan was saying, this over and over and over again, and these negative communication styles and unhealthy patterns happen, we start to internalize that and believe it, right? And that's why it's sometimes dangerous to be in those toxic environments when they're chronic and we've done everything within our control, but the other person isn't willing to give. Just looking here, see if there's any questions. Somebody else like to read minds as a child. Aren't you glad though you're not now?
Sure am.
And I have a few more questions there, but I can't see them all for some reason on my computer. But if there's any questions, you can always email Elaine, and this webcast is going to be posted up on the website. So if there's any material you wanted to reference back to, a lot of the information is contained in some of the strategies and even user-friendly wording and how we can communicate is in the book, Setting Boundaries, Finding Peace. So that's a great resource as well. But remember, and this is really vital, it's never too late. And even as Joan just said, how difficult it is, even though she's reestablishing that boundaries and she's getting ghosted and all those things are happening, that's their response to your boundary setting, right? But it's never, never, never too late to reestablish different boundaries with those we love and care about. Having strong boundaries and clearly communicating is what sustains relationships and gives us the energy and peace to enjoy our lives. So thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure to meet you all and to be a part of the Conquer the Clutter podcast. I'd like to thank Elaine for giving me the opportunity. And again, there's also additional information on boundary setting that were in the previous 2 segments. And also within the book, Finding Peace, Set Boundaries, Find Peace, and God to Reclaiming Yourself. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and sharing in this amazing opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent, Bye. Excellent.
Bye.
Oh my God. Okay.